The first whistle didn't bother me. The second one made me stop walking. I was hiking alone in a national park known for its long forest trails and mountain overlooks. It wasn't one of the famous parks that attracted huge crowds every day. Even during the busiest months, there were entire sections where you could hike for hours without seeing another person. That morning, I'd started early and had already been on the trail for about 3 hours. The first whistle came from somewhere off to my left. 3 short notes. Sharp, clear, human. I assumed it was another hiker, maybe someone trying to get a friend's attention. I kept walking. About a minute later, I heard it again. The exact same 3 notes. This time, it sounded closer. I stopped and looked into the trees. Nothing.
The forest was thick enough that visibility disappeared after 30 or 40 feet. Beyond that, everything blended together into dark green shadows. I listened for a few seconds. No voices, no footsteps, no movement, just the wind. Eventually, I shrugged it off and continued down the trail. Around 20 minutes later, I reached a scenic overlook facing a valley below. I stepped up to the railing and pulled out my phone. No signal. Not surprising. I took a couple pictures anyway. As I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the whistle came again. 3 notes, directly behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly lost my balance. Nobody. The trail behind me was completely empty. I stared for several seconds. The path stretched straight through the trees. If someone had been standing there, I would have seen them. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Not fear, just uneasiness.
The kind that tells you something isn't right. I left the overlook and continued hiking. Faster this time. About half an hour later, I noticed something beside the trail. At first, I thought it was camping equipment. As I got closer, I realized it was a backpack. A large hiking backpack lying on its side. One of the compartments was open. A water bottle sat a few feet away. Another farther down the slope. Almost like someone had dropped everything in a hurry. I looked around. Nobody. "Hello?" I called. No answer. The backpack looked clean, recent, not something abandoned weeks ago. I considered checking inside, but decided against it. Maybe the owner had stepped off the trail for some reason. Maybe they were nearby. I figured I'd report it when I returned to the visitor center. As I turned away, the whistle echoed through the forest again. 3 notes, closer than ever. I froze. A few seconds later, it came again. Then again. The sound seemed to move. First from my left, then behind me, then somewhere ahead. My skin crawled. Whoever was making that sound wasn't staying in one place. They were moving. And somehow, they always seemed to know exactly where I was. I checked my phone. Still no signal. The parking area was more than 4 miles away. For the first time that day, being alone in the forest stopped feeling peaceful. I started walking faster. The trail narrowed as it wound through a section of dense pines. The trees stood so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. Everything felt darker, quieter. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. Not directly behind me. Off to the side. Hidden among the trees. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I started walking. The footsteps returned. Slow. Careful. Keeping pace with me. My heart started pounding. I turned suddenly toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees. But I could have sworn I saw movement.
Like someone stepping behind a trunk at the last second? I stood there for almost a minute, listening, waiting. Then the whistle came again. 3 notes, much closer. Close enough that I felt an instant surge of adrenaline. I didn't call out this time. I just kept moving, fast. The trail eventually crossed a small wooden bridge over a shallow creek. As I stepped onto it, I noticed something caught between the rocks below. A bright orange jacket. I climbed down the bank to get a better look. The jacket was torn. One sleeve had been ripped nearly in half. Nearby was a hiking pole. Broken. I immediately thought of the backpack. The same bright orange color, the same style. A bad feeling settled over me. I climbed back onto the trail and continued toward the parking lot. Now, I wasn't thinking about scenery. I wasn't thinking about finishing the hike. I just wanted to get out. The whistle returned. This time, it sounded close enough to be only a few yards away. I broke into a jog. The whistle followed. 3 notes. Again. And again. Never too close. Never too far. Always somewhere behind me. The trail finally widened as it approached the final mile. Relief washed over me. I knew I was getting close to civilization. Then, I noticed something that made me stop cold. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the dirt beside the trail. Not hiking boots. Bare feet. Large bare footprints. Walking parallel to the trail. Keeping pace with it. Keeping pace with me. I stared at them for several seconds. The prints continued into the trees, then vanished. The whistle sounded again, closer than it had ever been. I ran. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. Branches whipped against my arms. My backpack bounced against my shoulders. Every few seconds, I expected someone to grab me from behind. The whistle kept coming. The same 3 notes. Again, again, again. Then suddenly, it stopped. The silence felt worse. I kept running. A few minutes later, I saw the parking area through the trees. Cars, people, safety. I practically sprinted into the lot. A couple standing near their vehicle looked at me strangely. I didn't care. I went straight to the ranger station. An older ranger listened while I explained everything. The whistles, the backpack, the jacket, the footprints. The ranger's expression changed the moment I mentioned the backpack. He asked where I'd seen it. I described the location. Then he exchanged a look with another ranger nearby. "What is it?" I asked. The older ranger hesitated. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Early that morning, another hiker had reported seeing an abandoned backpack in that same area. The rangers had already sent someone to investigate. When they arrived, the backpack was gone. "So, somebody picked it up?" I asked. The ranger slowly shook his head. "No." I frowned. "Then where did it go?" He looked uncomfortable. "That's the problem. We don't know." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked me one final question. "Did you ever actually see who was whistling?" I shook my head. "No." The ranger nodded slowly. For some reason, that seemed to bother him even more. I left shortly afterward and drove home. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Eventually, I convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation. Another hiker. Some prank. Maybe someone living illegally in the forest. Anything. A few months later, I was scrolling through a hiking forum when I saw a discussion about strange experiences in that same national park. One comment caught my attention immediately. The person described hearing 3 short whistles while hiking alone. Another replied saying they'd experienced the exact same thing. Then another and another. None of them had ever seen who was making the sound. The final comment in the thread was posted by someone claiming to be a former park employee. It was only 1 sentence long, but it still bothers me every time I think about it. It said, "I never heard the whistles myself, but every missing person case I worked on started with that exact description." 3 short notes coming from somewhere in the trees. The truck shouldn't have been there. I was hiking through a less popular section of a national park when I came across an old fire road hidden behind a rusted gate. The road wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd picked up that morning. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something caught my attention almost immediately. Fresh tire tracks. The mud was still damp from rain the night before, and the tracks looked recent. Very recent. Which didn't make sense. The gate was covered in rust. A faded sign hanging from it read, "Road closed. Authorized personnel only." The sign looked years old, yet someone had clearly driven through there. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the road. About 15 minutes later, I saw a white pickup truck parked among the trees. The vehicle looked old, but not abandoned. The tires were inflated. The windows were intact. Most importantly, the hood was warm. Someone had been there recently. I called out. No answer. I walked around the truck. No license plate, no company markings, nothing. Then I noticed a laminated ID card hanging from the rearview mirror. I couldn't read all the details through the dirty glass, but I could make out enough. National Park Service. Employee. My first thought was simple. Maintenance worker. Problem solved. I started walking away. Then I looked back. The driver's seat was empty, but I could have sworn I saw movement in the rearview mirror. Like someone ducking down. I stopped. Stared. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Still, I suddenly didn't feel comfortable staying there. I headed back toward the main trail. About 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow. Deliberate. Not on the road. In the trees. Whenever I stopped walking, the footsteps stopped. Whenever I started moving again, they returned. The sound followed me for nearly half a mile. I never saw anyone. Not once. When I finally reached the main trail, the sound disappeared. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think about it. That night, while scrolling through photos I'd taken during the hike, I noticed something strange. One of the pictures accidentally included part of the truck. When I zoomed in, I could clearly read the employee ID hanging inside. A name. Jason Miller. I didn't think much of it at the time. The next morning, I stopped by the ranger station before leaving the park. Mostly out of curiosity. I told a ranger about the truck. The moment I mentioned the employee ID, his expression changed.
"What name did you say?" he asked. "Jason Miller." The ranger stared at me. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he asked me to repeat it. I did. His face went pale. Another ranger walked over.
The first ranger explained what I'd said. The second ranger looked just as uncomfortable. Finally, I asked the obvious question. What is going on? Neither ranger answered immediately. Instead, one of them asked to see the photograph. I handed over my phone. Both men studied the image. Then one quietly said, "That's impossible." A chill ran through me. The older ranger finally explained. Jason Miller had worked in the park years earlier. He'd been part of a small maintenance crew responsible for inspecting remote roads and trails. One morning, he drove out to investigate storm damage. He never came back. Search teams spent weeks looking for him. No body, no clues, nothing. Even his truck disappeared. I felt my stomach drop. I pointed at the picture. What do you mean disappeared? That's his truck. The ranger slowly shook his head. No. Then he pointed at the photo. That was his truck. For a moment, nobody spoke. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe someone bought it. Maybe the vehicle had been recovered. Maybe there was some mistake. The ranger interrupted my thoughts. We never found the truck. I stared at him. What? It vanished with him. The room suddenly felt colder. I told them exactly where I'd seen it. The rangers exchanged another look. One grabbed a map. The other radioed someone. Within minutes, they were organizing a search. Before I left, one of them took down my contact information. A week later, I received a phone call. It was one of the rangers. I immediately asked if they'd found the truck. There was a long pause. Then he answered, "No." My stomach sank. What do you mean, no? The ranger explained that multiple employees searched the entire area. The road, the woods, everything. There was no truck. No tracks, nothing. It was as if the vehicle had never been there. I reminded him about the photograph, the ID, the name. The ranger didn't argue. Instead, he asked a question. Have you looked at the original image recently? I opened the photo while we were still on the phone. At first, everything looked normal. The road, the trees, the side of the truck. Then I zoomed in. My blood ran cold. The employee ID was gone. Not blurry, not unreadable. Gone. The rearview mirror was empty. Completely empty. I checked the screenshot I'd sent a friend that same night. The ID was visible there. Clear as day. Jason Miller. But somehow, in the original image, it no longer existed. I still have both files. One shows the ID. One doesn't. I've never been able to explain it. What bothers me most isn't the missing truck or the disappearing ID. It's something the ranger said before ending the call. According to official records, the last known location of Jason Miller before he disappeared was the exact stretch of fire road where I found the truck. I didn't realize anything was wrong until a ranger asked me who I'd been talking to. A few years ago, I visited a national park while traveling through another state. I only planned to spend a day there before continuing my trip, so I arrived early and headed straight for the visitor center to grab a trail map. The parking lot wasn't very busy. There were maybe a dozen cars scattered around, along with a few RVs parked farther away. As I walked toward the building, I noticed a ranger standing beside a large trail map mounted on a wooden board. He looked like he was in his late 40s or early 50s. Average height, short brown hair, clean-shaven, nothing unusual about him. He smiled when he saw me looking at the map. "First time here?" he asked. I nodded. He stepped closer and pointed toward one of the marked trails. "If you want the views everyone posts online, That's the one." Then he pointed somewhere else, a trail I hadn't even noticed. "But if you want something quieter, take this one." I looked at the map. The trail was barely marked. "What makes it better?" I asked. The ranger smiled. "Most people don't know about it." That answer alone convinced me. I thanked him, took a picture of the map, and headed out. The trail began normally enough. For the first mile, everything looked exactly like the rest of the park. Dense forest, occasional overlooks, nothing strange. What stood out was how empty it was. I didn't see another hiker. Not one. Normally that wouldn't bother me. In fact, I usually preferred quieter trails. But something about the silence felt unusual. Even the birds seemed absent. After another 20 minutes, I reached a fork. There wasn't a sign. Just two paths splitting in different directions. I pulled out my phone and checked the picture I'd taken of the map. The ranger's trail continued left, so I followed it. The farther I went, the rougher the trail became. Branches hung across the path, tall grass covered parts of it. It almost looked abandoned. Eventually, I came across a small wooden cabin hidden among the trees. The structure looked old, very old. The windows were boarded up, part of the roof had collapsed. I figured it was some kind of former ranger station. I walked around it for a minute before continuing. That's when I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Someone else's. The prints led behind the cabin. I considered following them. Instead, I kept moving. Something about that place made me uncomfortable. About half an hour later, I reached a small clearing. An old fire tower stood in the middle of it. The tower looked abandoned. Rust covered most of the metal. A chain blocked the staircase leading upward. Attached to the chain was a sign. Area closed. No entry. I remember staring at it, confused. Why would a ranger recommend a trail leading to a restricted area? That question stayed in my mind for the rest of the hike. I turned around and started heading back. The walk back felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Just trees. Still, the feeling never left. When I finally returned to the visitor center, I decided to ask the ranger about the tower. The problem was, he wasn't there. At first, I assumed he'd gone inside, so I entered the visitor center and approached the front desk. A younger ranger greeted me. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said. "I was looking for the ranger who recommended that trail near the old fire tower." The ranger frowned. "What ranger?" "The guy outside." I pointed toward the parking lot. "He was standing by the trail map earlier." The younger ranger looked confused. "There hasn't been anyone outside all day." I laughed. "Sure there has." He shook his head. "No, it's just been me and two other employees." The smile disappeared from my face. I described the man, his age, his appearance, his uniform, everything. The ranger listened carefully. Then something changed in his expression. He wasn't confused anymore. He looked uncomfortable. "Can you wait here for a minute?" he asked. I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. A few minutes later, another ranger joined us. This one was older. I repeated the story. Again. Neither ranger interrupted. Neither ranger spoke. They just listened. When I finished, the older ranger asked a question. "Are you sure he was wearing a ranger uniform?" "Positive." "And he directed you toward the old fire tower?" "Yes." The two exchanged another look. A look I still remember. The kind of look people give each other when they don't want to say something out loud. Finally, I asked the obvious question. What is going on? The older ranger sighed. Then he motioned for me to follow him. He led me into a back office area that wasn't open to visitors. The walls were covered with framed photographs. Past employees, retired rangers, seasonal workers. The ranger stopped in front of one section.
"Take your time," he said. "See if you recognize anyone." I looked through the photos. Most were old. Some looked decades old. Then I froze. My stomach dropped instantly. One picture showed a man standing beside a park vehicle. He was smiling directly at the camera. I recognized him immediately. The hair, the face, the smile, everything. It was him, the ranger I'd spoken to that morning. I pointed at the photograph. "That's him!" Neither ranger responded. I looked back at them. Neither seemed surprised. "Who is he?" I asked. The older ranger took a deep breath. His name was Daniel. The word was, not is. Was. I felt my chest tighten. The ranger continued. He was a seasonal employee here. I stared at the photo. Okay. The ranger hesitated. Then he said something that made every hair on my body stand up. He disappeared. The room suddenly felt much smaller. What do you mean, disappeared? No one knows exactly what happened. I looked back at the photograph. The smiling man suddenly seemed different, less friendly, less normal. When? I asked. The ranger glanced at the frame.
About 15 years ago. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. 15 years? That was impossible. I had spoken to that man less than 4 hours earlier. The ranger explained that Daniel had gone missing while working near the same trail. Search teams spent weeks looking for him. Nothing was ever found. No body, no equipment, no explanation. He simply vanished. The official investigation eventually went cold. Everyone assumed he died somewhere in the wilderness. But nobody ever proved it. I remember laughing nervously. Not because anything was funny, because my brain was desperately trying to find another explanation. Maybe the photo looked similar. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe another employee resembled him. Anything. The older ranger seemed to understand what I was thinking. Without saying a word, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old staff photo. There were 6 employees standing together. Daniel stood in the center, wearing the exact same uniform I'd seen that morning. Same patch, same badge, same hat. My mouth went dry. There was no mistake, no resemblance. It was the same man. The ranger who had smiled at me. The ranger who had pointed me toward the trail. The ranger who wasn't supposed to exist. I left the visitor center shortly afterward. I didn't stay in the park. I didn't even finish the day. I got in my car and drove away. The entire time, I kept replaying the conversation in my head. One detail bothered me more than anything else. The trail. Why had he sent me there? Out of every trail in the entire park, why that one?
Months later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for information about Daniel. Most of the details matched what the rangers told me. Missing. Unsolved. Never found. But one detail stood out. According to an old newspaper article, the last confirmed sighting of Daniel occurred near the abandoned fire tower. The same fire tower he directed me toward. The same tower at the end of that trail. I closed the article and never looked into it again. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone played a strange prank. Maybe I somehow misidentified a living employee.
I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. When I first met that ranger, he smiled and said one sentence before pointing me toward the trail. At the time, it sounded completely normal. But after everything that happened, those words have never left me. Most people don't know about it. And somehow, I don't think he was talking about the trail.
If you had to choose, let me know which story was the most disturbing. The whistling trail, the missing park employee, or the ranger who wasn't supposed to exist. And if you're looking for more true horror stories, check out my Hiking Horror Stories video next. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe out there.